Chapter 4. What did Jesus say? As we begin our exploration of what the Bible teaches about divorce and remarriage, it's crucial to start with the teachings of Jesus. His words provide the foundation for understanding this complex topic, as they set the stage for how divorce and remarriage were to be approached by his followers. Jesus talks about divorce and remarriage in 4 places in the Gospels: Matthew chapter 5 verses 31 through 34, Matthew chapter 19 verses 3 through 12, Mark chapter 10 verses 11 and 12, and Luke chapter 16 verse 18. Proponents of the permissive view tend to focus primarily on the Matthew passages, as these are the only ones that contain the exception clause, which they interpret as permitting remarriage under certain circumstances. The exception clause, found in Matthew chapter 19 verse 9, states, quote, "And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for immorality, and marries another woman, commits adultery." Matthew chapter 19 verse 9. This clause, "except for immorality," has been the basis for many interpretations that allow remarriage. Much debate has arisen around the meaning of immorality or fornication in this context. Additionally, people argue if the exception clause applies to divorce only or to remarriage as well. We will deal with those issues in detail in later chapters. Supporters of the traditional view emphasize the passages in Mark and Luke, which do not include any exceptions, thus supporting a stricter interpretation. For example, Luke chapter 16 verse 18 states, quote, "Everyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, and he who marries one who is divorced from a husband commits adultery." Luke chapter 16 verse 18. This verse presents a prohibition from remarriage without any exceptions, emphasizing the permanence of marriage and the consequences of remarriage after divorce. How to reconcile? The key question is, how do we reconcile these passages? Did Jesus intend for the exceptions in Matthew to also apply to the teachings in Mark and Luke? In the 4 different books we call the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, one author may record events slightly differently than another. It's the job of the student of the Bible to figure out how to reconcile those differences in a way that makes sense. I believe this issue can be resolved by carefully analyzing each passage and creating a detailed comparison chart with those things we can be certain of. In this way, we can easily see how Jesus' teachings align with those of Paul in the Old Testament in later chapters. This approach will help us determine whether our conclusion about divorce and remarriage, that divorce is permissible in the case of fornication, but remarriage is never allowed while the spouse is still alive, is accurate. Jesus' teachings on divorce and remarriage. I will begin by examining the passages that do not contain exception clauses. This way, when we analyze the passages that do include exceptions, we can clearly understand what these exceptions are modifying and how they differ from the general teaching. Luke chapter 16 verse 18. Quote, "Everyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, and he who marries one who is divorced from a husband commits adultery." End quote. Luke chapter 16 verse 18. Everyone. Jesus says that everyone who remarries after divorce commits adultery. This is a problem for the permissive view. If Jesus really meant that some people could get remarried after divorce, as the permissive view teaches, then this would be a blatant contradiction. You could say that Jesus was speaking in hyperbole here, or just using strong language to make a point, as he does elsewhere, but that is not clear from the text in my opinion, and it's dangerous to change the core meaning of Jesus' clear teaching without a very good reason. I will not make too big of a deal of the word everyone here, but I will point out that if the thesis of this book is correct, then this verse simply means what it says. Who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. One point that is often overlooked in this passage is that Jesus seems to assume divorces will happen, but it's only remarriage after divorce that he calls adultery. This is a problem for the no-divorce view. If Jesus really meant that all divorce is adultery, as the no-divorce view teaches, then why bring remarriage into this at all? Why not just say, whoever divorces his wife commits adultery? Instead, he says, Quote, "Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery." End quote. We will see more evidence that Jesus allows for divorce but not remarriage as we progress. "And he who marries one who is divorced from a husband commits adultery." The second half of this verse is a major problem for the permissive view, since it is teaching that marrying someone who has been divorced makes both parties guilty of adultery. The significance of Luke chapter 16, verse 18b lies in its directness. It provides a blanket prohibition against marrying a divorced person without reference to any exception. There's no discussion about the cause of the woman's divorce in this passage. Was she the innocent party or the guilty party? It doesn't seem to matter. He simply says that to marry a divorced person will cause you to commit adultery. Why the exception clause cannot apply to Luke chapter 16, verse 18. For those who attempt to apply the exception clause from Matthew chapter 19, verse 9 to Luke chapter 16, verse 18, two significant challenges arise. 1. The command is directed toward someone who has not been divorced. Luke chapter 16, verse 18 seems to specifically address a man who is considering marrying a divorced woman. The command is therefore directed at someone who has never been divorced based on the context. He has either never been married before or a widower. The key point is that this man is explicitly instructed not to marry a divorced woman, which makes applying the exception clause from Matthew chapter 19, verse 9 to him in this situation irrelevant, as he has never been divorced. This passage simply stands as a prohibition against marrying a divorced person. And 2, inapplicability of the exception clause to the divorced woman. One might argue that the exception clause could apply to the divorced woman, suggesting that she could be free to remarry this man if her divorce was due to her original husband's fornication. However, this reasoning fails because it disregards the underlying logic of the prohibition. The only way adultery could be committed in this case is if one of the parties is still considered married to another living spouse by God. And since the man in context is either a virgin or a widower, the divorced woman must be the reason for the adultery in this case. In other words, her previous marital bond is still viewed as intact, regardless of the circumstances of her divorce. The best explanation for this passage is that all remarriage after a divorce is forbidden, regardless of the reason for the divorce, which is exactly what the first part of the verse also seems to teach. Graphing out Luke chapter 16, verse 18. Luke chapter 16, verse 18. Remarriage after divorce is adultery. Yes. Marrying a divorcee is adultery. Yes. Divorcing improperly equals guilt of adultery. No. Sex is reversed. No. Exceptions for divorce. No. It was an obvious conclusion to affirm both remarriage after divorce is adultery and marrying a divorcee is adultery in our chart, as this passage clearly supports both points with minimal room for disagreement. Mark chapter 10, verses 11 and 12. Moving on to the next instance where Jesus addresses this issue, which is another case where no exception clause is present. Quote, "And he said to them, 'Whoever divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her, and if she herself divorces her husband and marries another man, she is committing adultery.'" End quote. Mark chapter 10, verses 11 and 12. Whoever. Just like the word everyone in Luke chapter 16, verse 18, Jesus uses a similar word, whoever, which strongly suggests that all remarriage after divorce is adultery with no exceptions. Mark and Luke both recorded Jesus using inclusive language, everyone and whoever, which somewhat supports the conclusion that no exceptions apply in those passages. Against her. It is interesting that Jesus says it is the man's first divorced wife who is being wronged in the case of a man marrying another woman after a divorce. He says it is the first wife who will have adultery committed against her. This is an important detail because it is essentially saying the same thing we saw in the Luke chapter 16, verse 18 passage, which is that to marry anyone who has been divorced commits adultery. This is because they are still married in the eyes of the Lord. And if she herself divorces her husband and marries another man, she is committing adultery. The second half of this passage reverses the gender from the first half. This shows that it doesn't matter if the husband divorces his wife, or if the wife divorces her husband. It's still adultery. We may take for granted the equal guilt of genders in our day, but there was a double standard in the ancient world at the time about this. For example, in Roman law, lex lulia de adulteris, a wife's adultery was always a crime, but a husband's adultery was a crime only if committed with married women. This passage is yet another blow to the innocent party idea that you can remarry if the other party was guilty of fornication, because Jesus says that remarriage would be adultery for both the man and the woman in this scenario. It's yet another way to say that regardless of the reason for divorce, remarriage is forbidden. Graphing out Mark chapter 10, verses 11 and 12. Remarriage after divorce is adultery. Yes. Marrying a divorcee is adultery. Yes. Divorcing improperly equals guilt of adultery. No. Sex is reversed. Yes. Exceptions for divorce. No. This passage asserts that remarriage after divorce is considered adultery without any exceptions. It conveys this idea twice, reversing the gender roles each time. This passage also teaches that marrying a divorced person is considered adultery because Jesus says that the man's remarriage is adultery against the first wife, meaning that regardless of who the man married, including an unmarried virgin, it would be adultery. Therefore, we must conclude that whoever marries a divorced person commits adultery, which is the very thing that Luke chapter 16, verse 18 also says. Matthew chapter 5, verse 32. Quote, "But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for the reason of unchastity, fornication, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery." End quote. Matthew chapter 5, verse 32. Everyone who divorces his wife, except for the reason of unchastity, fornication. This passage presents an exception clause, but the exception, except for fornication, explicitly applies only to divorce, not remarriage. This distinction is important because it clarifies that Jesus did not provide an allowance for remarriage in this verse at least, only for the act of divorce itself. For the reason of unchastity. The word unchastity here is sometimes translated as fornication or sexual immorality and is translated from the Greek word porneia. In chapter 12, I will examine this word in depth, as it plays a crucial role in this study, particularly for those who hold the no-divorce perspective. For now, it's enough to point out that this passage suggests an acceptable reason for divorce, likely related to sexual immorality. Makes her commit adultery. I think that this might be one of the most important and often overlooked parts of Jesus' teaching on divorce and remarriage, and it's crucial to understanding the more popular exception clause in Matthew chapter 19, verse 9. Jesus says that someone who divorces his wife, except for the reason of unchastity, makes her commit adultery. So we have here a third sin, besides remarriage after divorce and marrying one who has been divorced. It is a sin not yet mentioned in the previous two passages. It says that if a man improperly divorces his wife for a reason other than unchastity, he causes her to commit adultery, meaning he brings upon himself the guilt of causing someone else to commit adultery. In the same way, if I forced someone to murder someone else, or I forced someone to steal something, I would be guilty of sin as well. Causing someone to sin is a sin in itself. Dean Taylor says the following about this. Quote, "What is most significant about Matthew chapter 5, verse 32 to this current study is that Jesus held the man guilty of adultery simply for divorcing his wife, even without remarriage. Jesus said that the man who divorces his wife actually shares in the guilt of the woman's remarriage by causing his wife's future adultery. Let's read the passage again. Quote, "Whosoever shall put away his wife, saving for the cause of fornication, causeth her to commit adultery." End quote. Matthew chapter 5, verse 32. In reference to the guilt of causing his wife's adultery by sending her away, Jesus gave only one exception, quote, saving for the cause of fornication, end quote. Why did Jesus grant this exception? It is very clear. The man was obviously not going to be held guilty of causing his wife to become an adulterer if she was an adulterer already. Please take special note of this fact, because that is all the exception clause is saying. The only exception that was given here in Matthew chapter 5, verse 32 is from the guilt of causing a woman to commit adultery. It says absolutely nothing about an exception for remarriage. As Bible commentators Dale Allison and W.D. Davies state, quote, the question of freedom after lawful divorce is just not addressed, and we cannot wring from the text what it will not give, end quote. This brings up another important question. In what way does a man cause his improperly divorced wife to commit adultery? The idea is that if a woman who is not guilty of adultery is divorced for some frivolous reason, then the woman will likely remarry, and as a result of that remarriage, will become an adulterer. The man, regardless of whether he remarries or not, will then be guilty of adultery, as he was the one who caused her to commit adultery. Why assume that she will remarry? A fair critique of this idea would be, why is it assumed that she will remarry if remarriage is supposedly forbidden? In response, I would argue that while Jesus' teaching clearly forbids remarriage, as evidenced in Luke chapter 16, verse 18, and Mark chapter 10, verses 11 and 12, cultural norms at the time differed from this view significantly. The prevailing belief in that era was that remarriage was permissible following any divorce. I will explain in a later chapter why this contradicts the true teaching of the Old Testament law. However, in Jesus' day, almost all the Jews had adopted the same practice as the ancient Roman world on remarriage, which was that remarriage after divorce was considered the norm. Only the radical Jewish group known as the Essenes forbade remarriage after divorce. This is why the Pharisees, and even Jesus' own disciples, were so shocked at his teaching about remarriage. They say about it in Matthew chapter 19, verse 10, quote, if the relationship of the man with his wife is like this, it is better not to marry, end quote. Matthew chapter 19, verse 10. My point is that in Jesus' day, as well as in our day, people will remarry after a divorce. It's just the way it is. It was especially the case in the ancient world, where an unmarried woman was not easily able to make it on her own financially, which is probably one of the reasons that God himself supports the cause of the widow. Therefore, in this passage, Jesus warns us that if the person you divorce is not already guilty of adultery, don't cause them to commit adultery by divorcing them, and thus bring the guilt of their inevitable remarriage adultery on your own head. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. The last half of this verse repeats the same idea found in the previous two passages, that to marry anyone who has been divorced before is adultery. Again, the word whoever is used, which reinforces the idea that, at least with regard to remarriage, there are no exceptions. It is considered adultery if the other spouse is still living. Graphing out Matthew chapter 5, verse 32. Remarriage after divorce is adultery. Implied. Marrying a divorcee is adultery. Yes. Divorcing improperly equals guilt of adultery. Yes. Sex is reversed. No. Exceptions for divorce. Yes. All of the yes responses for Matthew chapter 5 verse 32 in this graph should be self-explanatory. I marked implied on remarriage after divorce is adultery because it implies that the improperly divorced woman who remarries commits adultery. Jesus seems to focus on the man's sin in this case, divorcing her for a reason other than sexual immorality. But he is guilty of adultery because her remarriage is assumed to be adulterous. Matthew chapter 19, verse 9. Quote, and I say unto you, whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and shall marry another, committeth adultery, and whoso marrieth her which is put away doth commit adultery. End quote. Matthew chapter 19, verse 9. This passage is one of the most controversial in the divorce and remarriage debate. For example, there is debate about the meaning of put away and fornication. Some claim that the word except is mistranslated and should be rendered as even in the case of. Others argue about the Greek structure, suggesting that the exception, fornication, applies to both divorce and remarriage, while others maintain it only applies to divorce. I will address all of these questions in detail in later chapters, but in this section, my goal is to try to graph out what we can be relatively sure that Jesus is saying in the Gospels and graph it out. And I say unto you, whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and shall marry another, committeth adultery. Like in Matthew chapter 5, verse 32, we will put off discussing the meaning of fornication until later chapters, and for now we'll assume that it is some kind of sexual sin that makes divorce allowable. The big question for our purposes is this: is Jesus in Matthew chapter 19, verse 9, teaching the same basic thing as he did in Matthew chapter 5, verse 32? That if you divorce someone improperly, you end up being guilty of their inevitable adultery, because they will probably remarry and thus commit adultery. In other words, is Jesus warning us of another sin that is possible, in addition to remarriage after divorce, one that almost no one in the modern church has even considered to be a sin, which is that even if you are innocent of adultery and you don't plan on getting remarried, if you divorce your wife for a reason other than fornication, you will be held responsible for the wife's inevitable adultery. Let's look at these two passages side by side. Quote, "But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for the reason of unchastity, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery." End quote. Matthew chapter 5, verse 32. Quote, "And I say unto you, whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and shall marry another, committeth adultery. And whoso marrieth her which is put away doth commit adultery." End quote. Matthew chapter 19, verse 9. The three sins related to divorce and remarriage. I would argue that by comparing Matthew chapter 5, verse 32 with chapter 19, verse 9, it becomes clear that Jesus was concerned about three different sins, all of which would lead to the guilt of adultery. 1. Marrying after divorce equals adultery. 2. Marrying a divorced person equals adultery. And 3. Divorcing someone for any cause other than fornication equals adultery. Dean Taylor says the following about this. Quote, "The difficulty with this passage is that the placement of the exception clause in the original Greek allows it to be read in two different ways. You can read it as the early church read it, and that is to harmonize it with the Matthew chapter 5, verse 32 account as an exception to the guilt of adultery for divorcing an adulterous wife. With this view, the scripture reads just like Matthew chapter 5, including its blanket prohibition against remarriage. On the other hand, the construction of the Greek will permit that it can be read, as the modern theologians have read it since Erasmus, as an exception to both the sin of divorce and the right of remarriage. Advocates of this view, like J. Murray, admit that the passage can be read in more than one way. Surprisingly, even Murray, who sides with the modern view, acknowledges that the early Christian view, quote, "does in itself make good sense and would solve a great many difficulties in the accounts given in the three synoptic Gospels." End quote. "And whoso marrieth her which is put away doth commit adultery." The second half of this verse in Matthew chapter 19, verse 9, only appears in the King James Version and other Bible versions that follow the Textus Receptus manuscript tradition. It is essentially the same line that appears in Matthew chapter 5, verse 32, which forbids marrying a divorced person. I will not make a major argument one way or the other about the differences in manuscripts here, other than to say that the line does not change anything, since it's essentially repeated from Matthew chapter 5, verse 32. If anything, it clarifies the point that remarriage is still forbidden, even though divorce, under the right circumstances, is allowed. Graphing out Matthew chapter 19, verse 9. Remarriage after divorce is adultery. Implied. Marrying a divorcee is adultery. Yes, King James Version. Divorcing improperly equals guilt of adultery. Implied. Sex is reversed. No. Exceptions for divorce. Yes. The yes for marrying a divorcee equals adultery is self-explanatory, as long as you are reading from the King James Version. I also consider the yes for divorcing improperly equals guilt for adultery to be a no-brainer, but I will mark it as implied in an abundance of caution. But I will have more evidence for that one as we progress. I also think the implied for remarriage after divorce equals adultery could have been a yes, but I don't want to stretch it. Why am I making this graph? Besides the fact that I believe many overlook that Jesus was addressing three distinct sins in the context of divorce and remarriage, I am presenting it this way because there is a significant connection to the Apostle Paul's writings on the subject, which I will explore early in the next chapter. Conclusion. In conclusion, our in-depth analysis of Jesus' teachings across the Gospels reveals a consistent emphasis on the permanence of marriage and a clear prohibition against remarriage after divorce. The exception clauses in Matthew's Gospel, when carefully examined, suggest that while divorce may be permissible in cases of sexual immorality, this exception does not extend to the right of remarriage. This interpretation harmonizes with the passages in Mark and Luke, which categorically forbid remarriage without any exceptions. As we move forward, we will delve into the writings of the Apostle Paul to see how his teachings align with those of Jesus. This exploration will help us determine whether our conclusion that divorce is permissible in the case of fornication but remarriage is never allowed while the spouse is still alive holds true within the broader context of New Testament teachings.